And let's just bring up one other thing that just happened today. So Manchin cut a deal with Schumer to bring back a slimmed down version of BBB. Thankfully, it's not 4 trillion like Biden wanted. It's 750 trillion. Okay. But what are they calling billion? Right. Okay. So, thankfully it's a slimmed down bill. But what are they calling this? They're all of a sudden calling it the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022.
What?
It's like, are you kidding? This doesn't pass the laugh test.
Are they trolling us with the names of these bills? The bills are never what's in the bill. Why don't they just call it the Green Energy Bill and the Screw Private Equity Bill? I mean, that's basically what it is.
Yeah.
Well, inflation reduction sells to everyone, right?
But Jason, the media is not holding the administration accountable. If we had an honest media, the headline today would be
You're not
the Biden recession begins.
That train's left the station, Sachs. You can only get it on this pod or other podcasts.
Yeah.
What did President Manchin get for this deal? He agreed to it. What did President Manchin get?
Well,
he secured some bag, right? Did you see what I sent you in the group chat?
There are going to be huge.
Why did he agree? He's like, I got a pipeline.
There's going to be huge handouts and pork for the state of West Virginia. There's no question about it. I mean, if you look at this bill, we should just look at what's in it. And more and more is going to come out over the next few weeks, right? It's only one day old. Drip. So we're going to learn a lot more about what's in this. But the
Republicans feel like, can you explain the dynamic as well after you get through this, of why the Republicans felt like now that he double-crossed them? Because the Democrats felt double-crossed by President Manchin, and now the Republicans are feeling double-crossed by President Manchin.
Well, I don't know that you can use the word double-cross because he's not a Republican and he had no obligation. But look, but there's no question that Manchin went back on what he said. Just a few weeks ago, he was saying that Build Back Better was unacceptable because it would contribute to the inflation problem. In fact, he's been saying that since last summer. He's been saying that we have a growing inflation problem. We can't contribute to it with a lot more government spending. Now he's agreed to a $750 billion of which something like 450 is new spending. So yeah, it's a smaller package than we had before. But if your concern was inflation a few weeks ago, you can't justify this. And you certainly can't call it an Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, that's just patently dishonest.
Well, how do they come up with it being inflation reduction? Is it because the healthcare stuff is theoretically going to help consumers have more money to spend?
Look, I think it's a tenuous argument, but if you want to make the argument, there's some cap on what seniors pay for prescription drugs, and then there are subsidies for people who are in the market for an electric vehicle. However, those are small adjustments. Those are small rebates to a small segment of the population. I don't think you can argue in good faith that this bill will reduce CPI. That's just not a plausible argument. And the vast majority of the bill, like you said, are subsidies for clean energy, which are basically handouts to special interests in the donor class in the Democratic Party. Let's just itemize some of these things. So the largest single outlay, $60 billion, is for, quote, environmental justice initiatives to address the unequal effects of pollution on low-income communities and communities of color. This includes $3 billion to invest in community-led projects in disadvantaged communities and another $3 billion to support neighborhood equity, safety, and affordable transportation access. Another $30 billion shoveled to states in the form of grant and loan programs for states' electric utilities to advance the green energy transition. $30 billion for additional production tax credits to accelerate domestic manufacturing of solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and critical minerals processing. So that's basically going to companies, right? $20 billion in loans to build new clean vehicle manufacturing facilities across the U.S., and $2 billion to revamp existing auto plants to make clean vehicles. $20 billion for the agricultural sector to, quote, curb emissions. $3 billion to reduce air pollution at ports. $10 billion investment tax credit to manufacturing facilities for things like electric vehicles, wind turbines, and solar panels. This seems redundant to the $30 billion outlay I just mentioned, but it's another giveaway to Democratic donors. And
wouldn't that be good for Chamath? Wouldn't that spending be good for energy independence in addition to climate? Because we've been talking about being energy independent. If we have more EVs, more batteries, more solar, that's a good thing, right? We want to be energy independent. So this seems like we get 2 wins, or possibly 3. 1, we get economic activity. 2, we reduce our dependence on foreign oil. And 3, we stop burning a hole in the ozone and increasing the temperature of the planet. It seems like 3 good things.
I think we have to see the forest and the trees here. And there's one good part of this bill And then there's the kind of more ugly reality that it avoids. The ugly reality is, unfortunately, or fortunately, or maybe without taking emotion out of it, we are dependent on fossil fuels for a very long time. It is a necessary bridge fuel. And so we need to, if we're talking about energy independence, it can't happen without us, frankly, drilling more and subsidizing the capital incentives of private companies to go and do this exploration work, which they have stopped, Jason. And the reason they've stopped is that they don't trust that these oil prices will stay this high. And so they don't want to make these outlays and investments for the next 5 to 10 years because they're worried that it's going to be a rug pull, which did happen to them in the back half of last decade and the early parts of this decade. So they're like once bitten, twice shy. They're not going to touch this stuff.
So you're saying oil companies that would do some exploration, it would cost them whatever amount, $2 to get the gasoline out of the earth and then process it, but they're afraid it's going to be negative. They're not going to be able to sell that gasoline or
oil. I think they're afraid that, the United States government may impinge on their ability to actually process it, that there may be tariffs and costs and taxes that they don't
They'll be upside down.
Forecast. They'll be upside down. So they just don't want to be. And right now, and you saw this, I don't know if you guys saw it, but like Shell and Exxon, and these guys are printing enormous record profits. So their incentives to change the status quo right now is zero.
They want less supply because then they can raise prices.
They have the perfect situation right now, which is it's an incredibly energy intensive world we live in. And we don't have nearly enough energy to do the work that needs to get done. And by the way, and you saw this week already where, Putin cut Nord Stream by another 50%. It was already running at 40% capacity. He cut it down to 20%. It's only getting worse. So I don't know. I mean, I think this bill could be good. I haven't looked at the specifics to give you a very
well, the specifics aren't even out yet.
Very fine-grained on it.
I did see the EV credits, Friedberg, and I thought that these were particularly well constructed. $7,500 off of a new car, but you have to be in the $150K salary or less on your taxes. So rich people can't get these, and it can only be for an $80,000 new car, a $50,000 or $25,000 used. And so they did seem to be staggered pretty well. And I do know that those incentives did work in the early days of Tesla because when you went to the website, you would look at the price and, this would be 10% off of a new car. And they did drive sales and it was pretty significant. What are your thoughts on the EV tax credit? Is that something that's a wise thing? And then what do you think overall about spending a couple of $100 billion on reducing emissions and becoming more energy independent at the same time? It seems like a laudable strategy to you?
Nope, seems like a total waste of money.
Okay, but, unpack it, please.
The EV tax credit is just giving away money to EV car manufacturers. There's already enough demand. The prices are low enough. There's enough consumer interest. There's enough consumer intent. I don't think you need to put this money out there. It distorts a market that's already functioning well. And this goes back to my point about the role of, government and how we create incentives or spend money. This is not a place we need to be spending money because there isn't an absolute need. There's no data that indicates that this will accelerate a transition to a carbon-free economy or that it's even needed. It really is a point of view that people hold and they believe that EVs are good. They're good for climate change. We should accelerate it. Therefore, we should spend money on it without any accountability or proof that these tax credits will actually motivate a market to move faster or quicker than it is already moving. And so it is just spending taxpayer dollars that could theoretically not be spent or be spent in a more effective way to improve the lives of people broadly in this country. So yeah, I don't fully agree with it. I haven't seen any data that tells me this makes sense.
Anecdotally, you don't think $7,500 off a $75,000 EV is attractive?
I don't think the EVs are $75,000. GM and others have great low-priced EVs, and there's a ton of market demand, and they can't keep up with production. And giving people $7,500 off a car that the manufacturers are still struggling to keep up with making because there's so much demand already. You don't need to do it. It is so much cheaper to drive an electric vehicle now by plugging this thing in than spending money on gas that people already want to buy these things. They pay for themselves super fast. Every consumer wants to save money on transportation, and you will save money by buying an electric vehicle. So you will already buy an electric vehicle. You don't need government money to get you to buy an electric vehicle.
To Friedberg's point, there was a lot of analysis that's been done on consumer adoption patterns. And typically for a new good or service, the tipping point is around 5% mass market adoption from when it goes from early adopters to the mass market. And EVs just cross 5%. So to his point, the historical data would tell you that we're now past the critical point where it's no longer questionable. Now it's just going to happen. So
it's not early adopters. We're getting to the mass market.
Now it's mass market. I mean, I'll tell you, like the best thing about EV adoption, or for me, for having an EV, is never having to go to the gas station to pump gas.
Amazing. Yeah.
I mean, just that one thing is a game
I'll just give
changer.
you guys, currently it's about 34.6 kilowatt hours per 100 miles. Okay, let's just do some math together. Let's say a kilowatt hour in the US costs about 10 cents. Okay, so that's about $3.50 to drive 100 miles in an electric car. That's a lot cheaper than paying $15 for gas to drive the same distance in a gas car. You don't need the tax credit to get people to buy these things. These cars are financeable. There's a very liquid, very active lending market. You get paid back on these cars within a few months if you're better LTV.
Where would you direct, if you were going to direct some stimulus to
I would not
reducing
stimulate
greenhouse
anything
gas?
right now. We just talked about how we don't need to stimulate the economy. I would not do any of
know where the
I'm
economy
not talking about the
is.
economy. I'm talking about you believe global warming's happening, Friedberg, yes?
Look, you want my point of view on climate change and industry.
Yes.
I think
That's what I'm getting at.
I think humans are on a naturally market-driven path to resolving carbon output in our industrial systems. And I don't think that government intervention with tax credits in specific consumer products is actually going to accelerate or resolve these changes that are needed. We need to not change consumer behavior. Consumers always want to have cheaper, faster, better. What we need, and at the end of the day, what we need to do is change the way that we're producing and making things, because that's ultimately what's going to drive this transition. And guess what? Consumers are demanding things that are, more efficient, that are more effective. And efficiency ultimately resolves to less carbon, ultimately resolves to less land, less energy. And industry has always resolved to greater efficiency. Natural market forces improve the efficiency of every industrial system.
So stimulus not necessary.
Mankind has ever created. And I think
Free
that
market does it.
It is a matter of time and a matter of natural evolution that we will resolve all of the factors that are driving climate change, from animal agriculture to transportation systems to energy systems. These are all going to get completely rewritten.
Will we do it in time,
by technical tools? We absolutely will. And at the end of the day, we can pull carbon out of the atmosphere and resolve it into products. We have tools to do that as well. So I am an eternal optimist. But in this particular case, I think that this century, much of what we're throwing our hands about, and remember, at the beginning of the 20th century, we thought we were going to run out of food. Then suddenly we invented the Haber-Bosch process and created fertilizer out of air. It was an incredible, incredible invention that saved mankind. We have had time and time again in the history of humanity these thoughts that we're in an existential crisis.
We thought we would have peak oil,
and we have had these points of view that we're in an existential crisis and humanity is about to end. And every single time we figured out a way out of it. And we didn't figure out a way out of it because the government came along and said, here's a tax credit. And we've gotten sick and we've gotten drunk on government spending. And we think that it is the solution to every problem we have as a species. You know what the biggest solution to our problems is? Our ingenuity. And then they'll let the markets figure it out. Consumers are smart. Businesses are smart. They will figure out ways to resolve these solutions. They don't need to have these handouts. And I think that that's a really important point that we've kind of missed. And I'll say, we were talking earlier about the economy. This stimulus, we've been giving ourselves caffeine since 2008 when the Fed started to build up this balance sheet. And we got used to the idea. Remember, before this, it was like, oh my God, multi-million dollar bills. And then it became multi-billion dollar bills. Then we had an $800 billion payout in 2008. And suddenly it was the multiple of 100 billion and the multiple of a trillion. And this expectation now, we've kind of reset the clock and everything now is in what multiple of 100 billion or what multiple of trillion we're going to spend on stuff. And no one's even batting an eye at the size of these the bills anymore.
Friedberg, what is a bigger existential threat to the United States? Is it climate or is it overspending by our government?
I think it's I think the biggest threat is productivity. I think that as a society, we've gotten to the point that we are so well off that we have so many things that we don't realize we didn't have 50 years ago. And read Pinkner's book on Enlightenment Now and just go through those 200 charts he puts in there. It will blow your mind. And then if you actually sit down and think about it and have a broader perspective on where we sit in this country today versus where we were 100 years, 50 years, even 30 years ago, you will say, oh my God, we live in an absolute luxurious state in this country. Golden era. And it is a condition that unfortunately reaps, a decline in productivity, because at that point,
we're entitled.
To some degree, some people are entitled. There are many people in this country that are still very hungry. There are many people in this country that still want to progress. And frankly, I think a lot of the lax behavior from government entities actually holds us back from accelerating our productivity outcomes, because it gives people many incentives and many reasons, and industry many incentives and many reasons to not solve problems. And I think that we solve problems and we're left to our own kind of...
There was an article I posted, Nick, you can put it in, about the Congo, and that they've decided to auction a bunch of land to oil companies. And I think before they tried to heed sort of, the West's directives, and they said, okay, well, let's build a land bank and we'll put a bunch of money in. And so then people in the Congo will have money for things, and you won't have to sell off the oil rights. And only tens of millions of dollars showed up. And then the Congolese were like, they threw up their hand. I'll just read the quote because I think it's interesting. Congo's sole goal for the auction, said the government official, is to earn enough revenue to help the struggling nation finance programs to reduce poverty and generate badly needed economic growth. That is our priority, he said. Our priority is not to save the planet. And it's quite a stark statement when you read it. But the reality is, in one generation, what will happen is they will feed the world's desire for fossil fuels. That will generate a lot of revenue. Hopefully, it doesn't get pilfered, and so it gets invested in healthcare and education. And within a generation, this country could be in a completely different situation, allowing the productivity of that entire population of that country to do what they think is right. So I'm generally of the belief that Friedberg's right on this.
Do you think, though, we should subsidize EVs to increase the percentage? And then also for solar? Just give me those two, Chamath. Solar and EVs. Do you think they should be subsidized or not in the United States?
It depends on how and at what point of the market cycle. The government's job is to create economic incentives that tip the balance of power towards investment. So if you are sitting here 15 years ago, the price of solar panels was sky high. It was incomprehensible that we could make solar equivalent to any other form of energy. The only way that we were able to close the gap was through government subsidies. But what that did was allow a bunch of companies to build businesses, to make revenues, and then also to make profits that then the public markets valued. Those public markets then put pressure on those companies to take those profits to become more efficient, to make the panels cheaper. And 15 years later, we're now at parity. So that was a really great example of the government stepping in to smooth out an imbalance in the investment incentive of the private markets. That is where they are exceptional. So in any market, they should be able to do this. But I think what Friedberg is saying is when then they do it successfully, and a market starts to germinate on its own, where supply and demand happens naturally between the private markets, the worst thing a government can do is step in, because it completely perturbs what true supply or true demand is. And that is what causes all of this crazy stuff that we deal with.
Cal, fast forward, assume that there's a $7,500 tax credit for EVs that artificially makes EVs cheaper, and then a better technology than EVs comes along. Let's assume it's some nuclear fusion, cold fusion, Mr. Fusion car, like from Back to the Future. And that car inevitably has to fight against the cheaper car because the cheaper car is subsidized by the government. We see this in a lot of markets that already exist in food, in energy, in infrastructure, where government subsidies that are embedded in the operating model of that industry, and that industry becomes kind of reliant and dependent on it, totally distorts the ability for the market to naturally transition to a more productive, more efficient state. And that more productive, more efficient state ultimately is cheaper, better for consumers, and better for the planet. And we hold ourselves back when we insert government dollars into well-functioning markets. I do think the government has an important role, as I mentioned last time, in pure science, in seeding new markets, in seeding these opportunities, in identifying paths that are quantum leap efficiency improvements in production systems, in industrial systems, in ways of living. Once those have been identified, those breakthroughs have been kind of catalyzed, boom, let the market take off, because it's going to take off. But we shouldn't be in this business.
So you believe EVs and solar are there already?
Absolutely. They're cheaper. And so let me just give you one point of reference. Let's use Chamath's Congolese example. Let's assume that there's someone that lives in the Congo. And I said to this person who's probably subsisting on less than $3,000 a year of income, and they're probably living, day to day on finding food. And you said to this person, in the United States, they have these cars. They're called electric cars, and they're cheaper than gas cars. And they're you make more money, or you save money by buying one of these cars, and they're cheaper now. And we're giving people $7,500 to buy one. This person who's making $3,000 a year would say, what? It is a state of luxury that allows us to do this. And frankly, I think it's a state of excess abundance. And that's what I'm most worried about.
Sachs, what are your thoughts on the government giving these type of subsidies to accelerate solar and EVs?
The whole bill seems anachronistic. First of all, it's raising taxes by $739 billion at a time when we're entering a recession. I don't know any economist who thinks that tax increases help the economy. We just talked about how the economy is in a really tenuous position. So this is not the right medicine right now. Then you've got the fact that the vast majority of the spending in this bill goes to these, energy subsidies, which are just, they're not going to help the average person. There's very little money in this bill that helps the average working class person. These are basically handouts. There's basically pork barrel spending for Democratic Party donors and special interests. And like Friedberg, I think, just articulated very well, they're not necessary right now. What's driving demand for electric vehicles and solar panels and so on is, first of all, the products just keep getting better and better. And second, they keep moving down the cost curve. As technology and innovation gets better, these products get cheaper. That's what's fundamentally driving the demand. We don't need the government now, again,
we need to accelerate it.
In an anachronistic way to shovel out all this money at a time we can't afford it. And look, I'm glad that $300 billion of the bill is supposedly going to deficit reduction. I hope those numbers actually materialize. But we're still $30 trillion in debt. And now that interest rates have gone from basically 0 to around 3%, the imputed debt service on our debt's basically has increased by almost $1 trillion. That is a lot of money.
So just like somebody who had a variable mortgage, the United States is on a variable mortgage with our debt. And so when interest rates go up, we're going to have to pay more interest.
So if interest rates stay at this, call it 3% level, which is roughly where the 10-year T-bill's been, bouncing around at, that is a lot of debt service, $1 trillion a year of debt service. So I think we're probably entering an overall era of austerity that lasts more than just this year or even this presidency. And I think we'll look back at all this wasteful spending, this last 10, 20 trillion of spending as money we didn't need to spend that we're going to be paying for a long time. So to be shoveling out another 300 billion plus of these programs, and once again, going to corporations and special interests, not to the average, person who needs it, it's just so irresponsible.